Hey folks, today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about Linux on aging hardware. And if I sound a little nasally, I apologize. I'm getting over a really bad cold. So yeah, we're going to talk about Linux on aging hardware. So I'm sure the first question is, what hardware exactly are you talking about? Well, not all of it's aged. Some of it's starting to age. Some of it is pretty old by this point. What we have here is a board you guys have seen before. It's the ASRock. The model number's down there. Gotta get on my stomach here. It is the ASRock A770DE Plus. If you can read that. Yep, it's an AMD motherboard that was given to me by Grateful42 because it was acting flaky with a computer, and for me it's actually been okay. I don't know if there's some kind of intermittent problem or what, but for me it's been alright. So what do I have in this board? Well, this board is a socket AM2, AM2 Plus, and AM3 compatible motherboard. A wide range of CPUs are compatible with this, all the way back to CPUs from the mid-2000s, like 2005 or so. And that's exactly what I've put in here. I have an Athlon 64 single-core CPU in here. Got some RAM, about 4 gigs. I have this video card, which is from about 2010. It is an AMD Radeon HD 5670 made by Gigabyte, where the E has somehow gotten all the way up there. I don't know how that happened. That's what I have. Whoa. This thing is moving on its own. But yeah, the E got up there. But this is the hardware I have in this machine. And, some of it is very old by this point. The processor is very old. The graphics card's about 6 years old, so it's getting old, but not quite old yet. There's also an old hard drive in here. This is a Seagate. This is a 200 gig Seagate drive that has a bunch of bad sectors on it and is kind of old and slow. So, not exactly top-notch hardware here, guys. This is literally a thrown-together computer. Not too bad for a thrown-together computer, though, I have to say. I plan to replace the CPU in this because it's a single core, but I figured we'd have some fun with it first and try Linux on old hardware. Now, what exactly are we looking at for a CPU? We are looking at an AMD Athlon 64 LE1600. This is a socket AM2 chip, so it's basically socket 939 with DDR2 support. So mid-2000s technology is what we're talking about here. It's a 2.2 gigahertz chip. It has a meg of cache on it. So look at the L2 cache, about a meg of cache there. So 1 meg per core sounds about right for what AMD usually does. And the LE in this case represents a chip that is low power. This is a 45 watt AMD chip, which is something you don't normally think of AMD for, is not using a whole lot of power, but they actually did this back in the day. They had a few chips that were low power, and this is one of them. And I used this in a file server for a little while. It was in my junk drawer, actually, until I replaced it with a socket 1156 motherboard. So this is what we're using to experiment with Linux here. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen some videos from people who do channels similar to mine who test out Linux. I know UXW Bill somewhat recently installed Linux on some computer. VWestlife, I've seen lately, has been experimenting with it. So what have I done? I have put Debian's net installer on this 1 gig SD card. I've installed it on this computer using the XFCE desktop environment, which is another one of those lightweight ones. You know, you could use LXDE or XFCE, and it's another one of those lightweight desktop environments. I chose Debian because it uses a very stable, reliable kernel. Generally, I'm using Debian stable, so it's a very rock-solid, reliable distro. It's what I run on my main computer every day, and it runs butter smooth on there. So I figure, why not use this on an older machine and use a very lightweight desktop environment. Now, when you install Debian on a computer, it tends to give you a very lightweight, minimal GUI. Like it doesn't give you any. It doesn't include any fancy configurations with it. It's just bare bones. You install Mate, you get the default Mate configuration. You install XFCE, you get the default XFCE configuration. They don't do any of that for you. It's very minimal, so it runs well on older hardware. And this, as far as the CPU goes, is about 10 to 11-year-old hardware now. So I think it's time to give this a shot here. Let's discard the changes and exit. As you can see, I've just shut this machine off after looking at the BIOS real quick. And I'd just like to reiterate before we boot the machine up and take a look at the operating system that there are no gimmicks here. This is not any trickery or fakery or anything like that. This is just some stuff I had lying around that I've configured in a way to basically make it aging hardware. You know, this board is using a socket AM2 chip that came out about 10 or 11 years ago. Single core Athlon LE 1600, and using this aging old hard drive that has some bad sectors on it that's a little slow. So this is by no means a system that's optimized for speed. This is just literally something I threw together. Now there are 4 gigs of RAM in here, but if you had 2 gigs, for example, you could still make it usable, like easily. And honestly, if you have a machine this old that has at least 2 slots, you could get 4 gigs in there no problem. Since it's DDR2, that was a thing back then, and still is today. So yeah, there we go. It's aging hardware. The graphics card is helping along a little bit, but you need a graphics card in the system because there's no integrated graphics, so we're going to use that. And we're using open source drivers here too. I didn't have to install any drivers to make that card work. I did have to install firmware-linux-non-free to make it work, but that was so it could connect the card with the drivers. And that was only because I was using Debian. If I put Ubuntu on here, it would do that automatically. And I have tested Ubuntu on here, and I found Debian with XFCE to be faster, much faster. So we're gonna boot this up, and you're gonna see it. Now, on that subject, I'd like to talk about some of the stuff that V. Westlife covered in his videos, where he tested boot speeds and launch speeds of programs and the operating system of Linux on a Pentium 4 rig, I think it was. Pretty sure it was a Pentium 4 rig. So it was around the same age as this thing, actually, as far as the CPU goes. And he you know, basically measured the timing of everything. And I think that was just a somewhat obsessive way to try to debunk people on the internet saying, well, if you use this, it's faster than Windows, you know. And you got to take stuff like that with a grain of salt because it's not always true. Really depends on what distro you're using. Depends on the desktop environment. It could depend on the kernel at that particular time that Linux is existing. You know, there's a lot of variables to it. And this is a variable I'd like to show that, you know, sort of compares to that video in a way, where I'm using a much more minimal distro than V. Westlife was. As many people tell you, let's try that again. Many people on the internet will tell you that Ubuntu is very light and you should use that on your old Pentium 4 computer or your old Athlon XP machine. And I don't agree. I don't think it's light enough. The desktop environment is lighter than, let's say, the Unity desktop, for example, but it's still not light enough to use on that old hardware. It's not that fast. You know, even the underpinnings underneath the well, especially the underpinnings underneath the desktop environment in Ubuntu-based distros aren't always extremely fast on older hardware. What is fast on older hardware is something like what you're seeing now, which is Debian 8 Jessie. And what I did was I stuck the net install image on this USB stick, installed it with the XFCE desktop, and what it does is it installs a default configuration of the desktop. Unlike the Ubuntu-based spins, where they actually configure it for you and give you all this fancy stuff, this gives you a bone stock experience with the desktop environment. Think of it as having on phones having stock Android versus something that Samsung puts on a phone for you. It just runs a hell of a lot better when it's bone stock. And that's exactly what the situation that we're having here. This is stock XFCE. I've configured it a little bit. I've changed the background to this moon thing, and I've moved the panel from the top to the bottom so that it's more like Windows. I've added a little widget down here that gives you CPU and memory gauges, because it's just nice to see how well this old CPU is doing. And that's all I've done to it. It's still bone stock. It's very basic theme. Here, I changed it to a dark theme as well. It had a lighter theme, but I changed it to a dark one. And it's a very fast, usable desktop. I'm not going to time how fast things open, because the whole point of putting Linux on old hardware like this is that it has more life to it than Windows would. And I'm not going to compare it to Windows XP, because XP's code is very old. XP's code might as well be 2001. It was added to over the years. I'd say Service Pack 2 was the last time a huge amount of code went into it, and that bloated it down just a little bit. And that's still pretty fast on machines like this, but I'm going to say Windows 7, because that's a relevant operating system that you could compare this to. If you were to put Windows 7 on a single core like this, it would not run particularly well, because it uses more resources, whereas Debian Linux here won't. And I'll prove that. So, you've seen the specs of this machine. The only thing that's really, the only two things that are really to speak of are the 4 gigs of RAM and the graphics card. And the graphics card helps along the video just a little bit, so that the CPU doesn't choke entirely. But this is feasibly a system that's been upgraded over time. If you look at it, like someone's old hard drive, someone's graphics card from around the time this board was new, actually, and an old CPU that somebody had just shoved in there. It's a very thrown together build, and it's still usable. You only see one CPU meter here, because there's only one CPU. There you go. Let's prove what that is. It's blue when it's actually using some CPU. And what we're going to do is we're going to perform some daily tasks here that you would use on the operating system. This is a usability test. Rather than testing how fast things open or how fast they shut down, or the time from when I push the power button to when I'm at a usable desktop, we're going to look at how usable is this on old hardware, because that is the whole point of using Linux on a machine like this, is to breathe life into this old hardware and make it relevant and sort of modernize it without bogging it down. And so let's say that you give this to somebody and they want to do some word processing. So let's launch LibreOffice Writer. Might be able to hear that old hard drive croaking along. Now, as you can see, that loaded pretty fast. And, you saw me boot it up and everything. That's from a cold boot. And, I'll move the font. I'll make the font like 72. So, typing is a thing. You can do that on here. Word processing is not an issue on here, and it shouldn't be, considering what's in it. Let's say you want to do audio editing. You could launch Audacity. Now this, as you can see, is taking a while. But it didn't take too long. You had to wait maybe 5, 6, 7 seconds, but it opened. And it didn't just bog down the CPU and sit there, like I've seen some things do on older machines. Now here's a big test. You want to go internet browsing. Here's Google Chrome. Now you could use Iceweasel, or Iceweasel is just Debian's version of Firefox, but I'm going to use Google Chrome for this example. Web browsing on a machine like this, on a single core in 2016, you'd think that would suck, right? Well, you'd be surprised. Let's go to YouTube and try to watch a video. Here's one I was using to test it earlier, actually. Let's use that video.
Goodbye. consistently been the front runner in this campaign. Congratulations on that. Thank you. Do you know what the secret is? Can you tell me?
Let's keep it at standard definition, because it will try to go HD, and that will make it choke.
Number one, all this long, or you don't want to say anything? Well, I mean, I can say we have a campaign that's...
But as you can see, you look at Donald Trump here in this video, and his hand gestures are smooth. When he moves his head back and forth, see? See, it's nice and smooth. You can watch a YouTube video on here just fine, even if you full screen it in standard definition at 480p, and you look at it. You look at it, and it's perfectly smooth. It's perfectly watchable. And I think the graphics card in this regard is giving it a lot of help. If I were to put a graphics card that was a little bit older in here, I think it would choke a lot more. But this is just something you can do to spruce up an old machine. You can give it a little bit of help by giving it a somewhat newer graphics card, and it can make up for some of the lack of CPU, and it'll be fine. But yeah, there you go. Browsing the web, watching a YouTube video works just fine. Go to dig.com here to read the news. Chokes a little when you try to scroll before the page is loaded, but once it's fully loaded, you can scroll up and down, and you can read the news. Let's find an interesting article. There you go, an article about Google doing artificial intelligence. And this is an Engadget article. So Engadget's a place you'd go to read like tech news normally. So that's a typical website. It takes a little while to load the web page, but it's perfectly usable. I've also installed AdBlock into this browser to make it a lot more lightweight, because ads can bog down and use some CPU on some of these old systems. And there you go. It's perfectly usable for browsing the web. No problem. Let's say you wanted to edit some images with GIMP. Now this will take a while to launch just because of the slow hard drive. Well, maybe not, actually. I've launched this once before. When I first launched it, it took quite a while, maybe about 20-30 seconds. But once you've loaded GIMP once, it speeds up very considerably. So I could make a new canvas here and, you know, draw something. Whee! And, you know, it's a perfectly usable machine, and it's very fast and responsive, as you can see. It's very nice. What else can I show you? Here's Task Manager. Just to show you what's going on. This is idle. It doesn't use much CPU. It's barely using any resources, which is what you want. Let's say you want to use an old machine like this to talk to your friends on TeamSpeak. Load up TeamSpeak. Launches quick enough. And, you know, click connect and connect to your friends and talk to them. Works just fine. Now, when you're actually talking, it might bog down the CPU a little bit more. I have not tested that, but I did test Firestorm Second Life Viewer, and that actually worked on an old system like this, mainly because of the GPU that I have in here. But it actually ran. It didn't bog it down too much. It got a little choppy here and there, especially in crowded areas. But I could still walk around. It was still usable. I was very impressed. So some of these machines can go a long way if you put the right operating system on them. And you can really do that with minimal distros like Debian, Arch Linux, Gen 2, where they're sort of more bone stock than you'd find on Ubuntu or OpenSUSE or Fedora, for example. Although even Fedora is pretty bone stock in terms of their installations, so that's not too bad. But this is just an example of how Linux can breathe new life into old hardware. It's not as easy as just well, let's just see what Ubuntu has to offer. Sometimes you have to dig around and look at other distributions. And when you're new to Linux, you just don't know these things. You think that Ubuntu is just the bog standard that everybody uses, but it isn't always. And and some of these other distros, like Ubuntu, is based upon Debian. So that, you know, by itself basically says that Debian's a lot more bone stock. And for machines like this that are starting to age, it works very well. You can breathe a lot of life into some machines. It's something I used to do around 6 years ago with netbooks and things like that. We used to put Linux on them and use them, and they worked great for that. Not so much now, but... and this is older. This is older and faster than a netbook, and more RAM, I think, too. But this is just to prove that breathing life into an old machine using Linux is more about usability and newer code running reasonably well on a system like this than it is the system booting up in an appropriate amount of time compared to Windows XP, for crying out loud. So, you know, this is just proof that you can do it. You know, no gimmicks, no tricks. It's a thrown together computer with some slow components in it, and it's still usable, especially with this graphics card. The graphics card gives it a lot of help. So if you have an old machine that you want to sort of beef up, you can use an older graphics card to do that. This is a 6-year-old graphics card, and it still boosts this machine up pretty well. So, you know, there you have it. That is just a demonstration of how Linux can breathe life into old hardware if you know what you're doing with it, and you use the right distribution and the right desktop environment. Once you have the chemistry exactly right, you get something beautiful like this. And with that, I think we will shut the machine down. And conclude this video. I hope you all enjoyed this, and have a good one, everybody. Ciao.